Hello everyone. This video is just to update you on some of the assignments and group discussions that have been done recently. The first thing I want to talk with you a bit about is your final paper actually, and how some of the assignments that you've been doing recently, excuse me, and that you'll be doing over the next coming weeks can fit into this final paper assignment. So the final paper in this course that you'll be completing for me is something like a mini literature review. So this week you've been reading about or listening to PowerPoints about what a literature review is. You also have had some experience in starting to better understand how a literature review functions by thinking about the PowerPoint that we did that talked about dissecting a research article or the different parts of a research article. And then as you begin to read your own scholarly literature that you'll use in your final paper, you'll also notice that each and every one of these research articles will include a section that is the literature review. And, you know, in a simple way, the literature review is just what the title seems to suggest. It's a review of the literature that exists, essentially like what are scholars writing about and saying about in relationship to the topic that you're interested in studying. And so it's a kind of a review of what that looks like. You've been doing some assignments for me recently that ask you to get scholarly articles that are relevant to your topic. These assignments are important. They primarily exist within the unit that looks at careful reading strategies, but they also are assignments that can work toward that final paper. So in the Reading Critically assignment, as well as the What It Says, What It Does assignment, as well as the 3-source log assignment, in each of these, you should be using for these assignments peer-reviewed scholarly sources. These are sources that are largely located in books. They can be book chapters or in academic journals that you can locate in the library or through the library databases. They are not popular press sources and they are not reference sources. So what they are is primary sources, and what this means is that these articles should be ones where the authors are collecting original data of some sorts. Maybe they're doing surveys or interviews or content analysis, or else they are constructing an original argument. They are making a kind of argument about maybe ideas, maybe about an event, and they are using other scholarly sources and other scholars to help build this argument. So in each of these assignments, there's other parameters that you can use, other characteristics that you can use to determine whether something is a peer-reviewed scholarly source and whether it's a primary source. If you don't quite know and feel lost in terms of finding these, you need to review the material that is included under week 3. That material should help you get a better sense of that. If you are using these kinds of sources for these assignments, then by the time we finish these 3 assignments, you will have all of the scholarly sources you will need for your final paper in this class. And so in that final paper, you are expected to have 5 scholarly peer-reviewed primary sources to use in that paper. So one of those potentially has been the Reading Critically assignment. The What It Says, What It Does assignment, this one, there was a screw up. It wasn't available to you guys. I mean, it was up on Blackboard, but you weren't able to access it. And so the due date has been extended on that. So please recognize that you still have time to turn that in. This assignment, while one of the primary purposes of the assignment, as you'll see on the guidelines, is to help you think more carefully about not just the content of an article, but how certain content functions in relationship to the overall argument. It also can help you build toward that final paper. By using a peer-reviewed scholarly source, it is one more source that you could use in your paper. So I want these assignments to work for you as you work toward that final goal. That will be the same for the 3-source log. This is your final kind of peer-reviewed scholarly source big assignment. It will ask you to read 3 primary source scholarly peer-reviewed scholarly primary sources, and to be writing about those. You'll have 2 more weeks to complete this assignment, but have it on your radar because it's quite labor intensive. At the end of these 3 assignments, you should have what you need to begin writing your final paper in this class. I also now want to talk to you a little bit about some of the group discussions that you've done recently. Give you a few updates about those. The first one asks you to think about evaluating the relevance of scholarly sources. So one nice thing about scholarly sources is that you can feel pretty secure that the credibility and the reliability of the information in these sources is of high quality. The practice of peer review pretty much ensures that these are going to be high quality resources. So they don't require quite as much scrutiny on that end as, say, a web source might, or a popular press source might. However, one of the more difficult things when we think about scholarly sources is to try to figure out, well, which sources are actually relevant to the topic that I'm studying. So for instance, maybe you're interested in social media. If I just type social media into the library database, Communication and Mass Media Complete, I'm likely to get resources that talk about everything from interpersonal relationships to depression to news circulation to political participation to market research. Social media is just broad, and all of those things will come up in relationship to that. However, it would not make for a good paper if I used those 5 sources to talk about social media. They're actually on different kinds of topics. So thinking about, well, is this really relevant to the research that I am doing becomes a really important question to ask when you're trying to find good scholarly sources to use. So in this discussion, group discussion, I asked you to imagine for a minute that your topic that you're interested in is really how social media is used as a news source and a tool for politics. So you've maybe explored this idea, thought about this idea of how people get news in different ways now. They're largely getting their news from Twitter or Facebook, and you're curious about how this might change the way individuals sort of think about politics or engage in politics in some way. Maybe a question that you've even thought about in your own life. So you might ask some general kind of questions of whether people are more likely to engage in politics if they use social media for news. Are they less likely? Or are they more likely to have the same views as their peers and therefore less likely to encounter differences that might spur them toward political outcomes? These are some of the questions that scholars have really asked about news circulation and political participation. So you imagine that this is your interest and you type in some key terms such as social media and news and politics, and you get a number of sources that come up. So will you use them or not? One of the important things to note here is that there's no one right or one wrong answer. It depends on the kind of information you highlight in the article and how you sort of think about that in relationship to your overall topic. So for instance, in this first abstract that you were given, talking to broadcasters, you could choose, these are the things that are highlighted in yellow, you could choose not to use this article, primarily because it seems to focus more on issues of producers of news, for instance, journalists or broadcasters, rather than the audience. You might say, well, I'm really more interested in how everyday people are getting their news via, other people linking it or sharing it. So I'm not really interested in what journalists or how journalists are utilizing this medium. It doesn't make sense for my article, for my topic. However, with this article, you could also sort of highlight what's in green and say, yeah, actually it does sort of make sense. Particularly because the abstract talks about how citizens engage in Twitter conversations with journalists. This is sort of suggestive of the idea that they maybe are more politically involved in that way. And then also this point that politically active citizens interact more often with journalists who share similar ideology. So again, making some kind of statement about the relationship between news, social media, and politics. So you could choose to highlight those elements and decide to use this article if you wanted. The next one, again, this one seems like one that would make a lot of sense to use. It talks about social media use for news, so that alone really highlights the connection that you might be looking for. And in particular, how it is used for things like social capital, how it might increase civic engagement and political participation. So this one seems to fit relatively easily. You could make an argument. With this article, it's less clear whether it's relevant or not. In some ways, one could make an argument that, yes, this abstract is relevant. It's relevant because it addresses, right here in the title, online news information seeking. So it's focused on the issue of getting news online. And other things that you might pull out are things like motivations and gratifications that are obtained. This means it's sort of focused on audiences and getting, and why they choose to get information from particular locations. But in other ways, the fit seems really forced, or it seems like it's not very relevant in other respects. So for instance, it's really about, if I look more carefully, what this article is really talking about is, the difference between whether people get their news by going to search engines or via social networks. And it's in Egypt. And more interested in particular of how each of these platforms are competing to attract different internet users. So even though it is somewhat relevant to the idea of getting your news on social media, it's not really about politics, and it's not really about whether that relates to participation in any particular way. So it would be pretty easy to say, well, there's some things that are similar, but it's not really related to my topic overall. This one seems much more in line. It's a clearer case of relevancy. It is about selective exposure in the age of social media. So this means like only reading the news sources that you want to read and not reading ones that are not in line with your interest. And how that might... And so we've seen particular things like widespread use of social media changes, news consumption, so some of those very ideas that we were struggling with, grappling with. And then pretty specifically that they demonstrate that social endorsements, so if your friend who is cool and interested in politics says read this, people are much more likely to select that content. And even if that friend is of a different particular political persuasion. So that might influence people's political perspectives or their choice to participate in politics. Twitter as a news source seems by the title to be something that would totally fit with our analysis, but once you dig into what the article is really about, it starts to seem less relevant. So it really talks about, again, news production rather than news consumption, and really talking about how Twitter is making its way into mainstream media construction of articles. And so even though Twitter as a news source seems like it would be a promising resource, when we dig a little deeper, we find it's really not all that relevant to our topic. And then lastly, performing the young networked citizen, celebrity politics, social networking, and the political engagement of young people. Already the title seems to suggest some pretty strong relevance. Thinking about the networked citizen, so people who are networked in some way, social networking in particular, and whether people are politically engaged. So I might choose to use it on this basis. I can read further and say that this article looked at how young citizens from these democracies use social media specifically in relationship to politicians or political celebrities, and whether it influenced their own outlooks on politics. So I might say that alone is enough of a connection. I might choose to say it doesn't fit because it's really about celebrity politics rather than everyday people.